Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for everyone for being here today. I'm really excited to finally give a talk at Tropilunch. I love the TCD program. I really like our community, so I'm happy to be here today. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm going to be discussing systems approaches to analyzing wildlife harvest and trade. And that's really the general umbrella theme for a lot of the research that I do. And the people that I talk to, my colleagues, my friends, sometimes get confused because I always talk about a different project, but I promise they all fall within a general theme. So, okay. So I'm going to begin by just introducing some terms because I know we all come from different backgrounds. But essentially, the term harvest, right? That's essentially the removal of animals or plants from a population, usually by humans. But you're going to see me use the term hunting, poaching, and exploitation. And though these terms can mean different things in different contexts, and depending on what discipline you're coming from or what perspective, I may use them interchangeably. But what's important to know is that I will make a distinction when it comes to discussing over-harvest and over-exploitation, which I will define soon. Then when I use the term trade, I'm going to be talking about any sale or exchange of wild animal or plant resources. And this can be for many, many different reasons. So people harvest and trade animals and plants and animal and plant products for a variety of reasons. That could be to mean nutritional, economic, recreational, economic needs, and etc. So you'll get a better understanding of what I mean by that in this presentation. So these are important terms because over the years I've learned to really appreciate that there's a big distinction. One thing is to harvest individuals and organisms from a population. One thing is to overharvest or overexploit. So these two I'll use interchangeably. And essentially, overexploitation of biodiversity has emerged as a critical threat to address in the science and practice of conservation. Overexploitation can be defined as the harvesting of species from the wild at rates faster than natural populations can recover. Species are exploited for a variety of reasons, as I mentioned, including for direct consumption and also for trade. But it is important to understand that many species are relatively insensitive to harvesting, remaining abundant under relatively high rates of offtake, whereas others can be driven to local extinction by even the slightest levels of offtake. And this really depends largely on the biology of the species. And as you will see, on a lot of other factors within the local context. And often, overexploitation acts in synergy with other threats, such as habitat loss and degradation. So exploitation of biodiversity for food, medicines, pets, and other forms of utilization can result in negative impacts, not only for the overexploited biological populations, but also for the persistence of diverse cultures and human societies that rely on these resources. Thus, overexploitation can also be a threat to the world's biocultural diversity. And we can define biocultural diversity as the diversity of life in all its manifestations, biological, cultural, and linguistic, which are interrelated within a complex social ecological adaptive system. And though there are different definitions of biocultural diversity that are used, I'm going to use it very loosely because when we talk about biological, cultural, linguistic diversity, we also mean the relationships that people have between their environments. We also talk about knowledge systems. So it's a very broad term and working definition that I use when I discuss biodiversity. So this biocultural diversity is found within a complex socio-ecological system. I'm going to use the term socio-ecological system, but in some of the literature, you'll also come across the term coupled human and natural system. And essentially, it's a system of biogeophysical and social factors that exhibits complex dynamics due to interactions between factors, okay? So systems thinking and systems approaches calls for an understanding of an entire system by understanding the individual components of that system. and the interactions between components, as well as emergent properties such as feedbacks. Systems approaches also place an emphasis on interdisciplinarity and the integration of natural and social sciences. So in the image that you see on the screen right now, there is an example of a recent interdisciplinary conceptual framework that was developed by Mary Blair and colleagues to analyze wildlife trade systems. So this framework is modeled after Elinor Ostrom's socio-ecological systems framework. The framework is theory neutral and can facilitate the exploration of variables that might be derived theoretically from different disciplines. As you can see here at the bottom of the figure, under variables to be measured. For each component of the system, under resource units, resource system, the governance system, and the actors, there's a lot of different variables that are derived from biology, ecology, anthropology, and other social sciences as well. So it is a guide to help choose variables to develop studies on analyzing wildlife harvest and trade systems and the interactions and outcomes. So it's really flexible. That's one example of a guiding framework and the type of research that is being produced now to guide our interdisciplinary studies. Here's another example of a socio-ecological system framework to understand carnivore poaching. This framework draws largely on concepts and theories in criminology, such as situational crime prevention, which tells us that in order for a poaching event to occur, you need a motivated offender, as you see on the left, as a human component. You need a vulnerable target. So in this case, it's a vulnerable individual, an animal. And then you also need the lack of a capable guardian. And so that's what we call guardianship factors, including anti-poaching units, road closures, fences, etc. So that's drawing from criminology and now an emerging field of conservation criminology. But a framework like this also draws from fields such as human psychology, social norms, and political science to understand the human motivations for producing a poaching behavior at the individual and societal level. And then when we look to the right, if we want to understand the vulnerability of a species or a population, we can draw from animal behavior, wildlife population, and community ecology as well to understand what makes an individual animal vulnerable to poaching or harvest, and then understanding also the landscape context and how that factors in. So these are guiding frameworks. And again, the variables that you choose to measure really depends on what we know. So if you conduct interviews as your first step of key informants or local community members about what is important to them or just to understand the local context, you may be able to narrow down a little bit of it on what variables from the human perspective and then what specific variables, say the habituation of an individual or the population size, if those might be important. So it's an initial step to then keep building and exploring using different disciplines to get a holistic understanding of the system. And so essentially these are the types of frameworks and approaches that I use in my research and that me and my advisor and my research group, lab group and colleagues are increasingly using and are incredibly useful. And I hope that I can convince you today after my presentation that these are critical approaches to use to analyze harvest and trade. So I'm gonna introduce a project now in which we used a multidisciplinary and systems approach to assess the ecological and social dimensions of a sustainable harvest program. And so this project was part of my master's research program at Columbia University and the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation at the American Museum of Natural History. So around the world, and especially in the tropics, people depend on wild resources to meet their nutritional, cultural, and economic needs. However, as I previously mentioned, unsustainable harvest of wildlife has emerged as a leading threat to biodiversity, as well as to the people who depend on those natural resources. And one mechanism through which we can try to achieve the dual goals of biodiversity conservation and sustainable harvest and use of wildlife is through community-based conservation and resource management programs. In this case study, we will explore the community-based management of freshwater turtles in the Peruvian Amazon. This research was based in Pacaya-Samiria National Reserve, which is a protected area in the Loreto region of Northeast Peru. Pacaya-Samiria National Reserve covers an area of about 20,800 square kilometers and is the second largest nature reserve in Peru and in the Amazon basin. It protects an area of low hills and seasonally flooded forests in the Amazon rainforest. The reserve is an increasingly important site for research and tourism, and is also home to a variety of communities who largely depend on the natural resources of the reserve for subsistence. And as you can see on this map on the left, the closest city to the reserve is Nauta, and then further up we have the city of Iquitos, and Iquitos is the capital city of the department of Loreto, which is the region in which this reserve is found. And later on, I'll discuss a little bit more about Iquitos, but for now, let's stick to Pacaya-Samiria National Reserve, and more specifically, the Pacaya Basin that you can see in the lower left part of this map, where it says Rio Pacaya. So South American river turtles and their eggs have been harvested, consumed, and traded throughout Amazonia for centuries by indigenous peoples, and this also has continued after colonization. So Podognemis unifilis, which is commonly known as Taricaya in Peru, or the yellow-spotted river turtle, has been historically distributed throughout Pacaya-Samiria National Reserve. The turtle species is listed as vulnerable in the IUCN's Red List of Threatened Species, and it's listed under Appendix 2 of the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species, or CITES. And being listed under Appendix 2 means that the international trade for this turtle species is allowed, but there are high regulations and restrictions. So in response to the decline of these freshwater turtles throughout Pacaya-Samiria due to unsustainable harvest, a local NGO and the Peruvian government implemented a community-based conservation and management program in 1994, whose goals were to recover the turtle population throughout its historic range and maintain a livelihood strategy for residents of nearby towns under an incentive system. Local people were given the opportunity to apply for recognition as organized management groups within different river basins inside the reserve. So Peru's Ministry of the Environment approves contracts, or what we call management plans, in which local people in groups of about 10 individuals apply to take part in this turtle management and recovery activities, with the incentive to legally harvest and commercialize a quota, a portion of the managed turtle eggs and hatchlings. So that's the incentive. You come and help us in the translocation and management activities, and you're allowed to harvest a certain amount of eggs and baby turtles, essentially. So different activities under the management plans include installing and managing artificial beaches during the reproductive period of the species and during the incubation period of the eggs. And you can see the artificial beaches in the images above. Activities also include releasing hatchlings into the water and general protection and of the managed sites. If the organized groups reach a certain renesting and hatchling release quota during the management season, and this is a quota that's set by the government, if they reach that amount, then they're able to legally harvest a portion of non-viable or infertile eggs and hatchlings for domestic and international trade. So in Pacaya Basin, which is the geographic focus of this study, one of the three major basins of the reserve, there have been 3 different management phases. The first phase ran from 1994 to 2007 and only allowed the harvest and trade of infertile or non-viable turtle eggs. After 13 years, the perceived success of the program led to the start of a second phase from 2008 to 2012, which now allowed the harvest and trade of non-viable eggs and 20% of hatchlings per year. And these were 20% of the hatchlings that were produced from translocation activities. This second phase also allowed the harvest of 1 adult turtle per group member per year for direct consumption. So in Pacaya Basin, there are about 18 management groups. And so that's about 180 individuals working on the ground in their translocation and management activities. And so during the third phase, which began in 2013 and was still operating as of 2019, there was an increase in the proportion of allowed harvested hatchlings from 20% to 40%, okay? So eggs and hatchlings are sold to domestic markets, and community members also travel to the city of Iquitos to sell hatchlings to local markets, but also to ornamental aquarium companies that then export them to meet demand from Asian markets, primarily in China and Hong Kong. Domestic uses in Peru include eating the eggs and keeping hatchlings as pets. While the uses abroad are unknown, but it is speculated that the turtles are used to make souvenirs and potentially used in traditional Chinese medicine. But this is really anecdotal data. The community-based management of this turtle species is now recognized internationally as a successful example of the recovery and sustainable legal harvest and trade of a threatened species. The case was recognized as a successful wildlife management model at the 28th meeting of the CITES Animals Committee and at the 66th meeting of the CITES Standing Committee. So we were interested in a couple of questions. We were interested in understanding, okay, what makes this program successful? We wanted to explore both the ecological and social dimensions of success. And so more specifically, we asked, is the current harvest of 40% of hatchlings per year sustainable? And how does this compare to perceptions of success and sustainable harvest, essentially, that are held by local stakeholders? What are the ecological and social indicators that are used by stakeholders to measure the success of this program? And finally, are there any barriers and challenges that may hinder the success and sustainability of this program? So these were our guiding questions. And like I said, we used a systems approach. So we wanted to integrate social and natural science approaches and take a more holistic look at the system. To address our questions, we, like I said, we included methods from both the natural and social sciences. So first, to assess the sustainability of the current harvest, we used population viability analysis. Population viability analysis, or PVA, is a method used in conservation biology to assess the probability that a population will go extinct over time. We use this user-friendly PVA software, Vortex. And Vortex is a widely used tool for demographic analyses of harvested populations and is the most frequently used tool for PVA in the Population and Habitat Viability Assessment Workshop process of the IUCN's Conservation Planning Specialist Group. In our quantitative models, we incorporated data on the biology of this turtle species to look at how the population would behave over time if 40% of hatchlings were harvested every year, and if this continued. To understand the different social and ecological indicators used by stakeholders to measure the success of the program, and to identify challenges and potential barriers to success in the future, I traveled to Pacaya Samiria and conducted a total of 40 interviews with members of organized groups and park rangers. I also compiled management reports and analyzed those reports. Here are some of the key results based on the interviews and data from the management reports regarding the indicators used to measure success and track progress, essentially, in the program. So I'm going to start off by discussing the ecological indicators. About 58 of the respondents stated that the turtle population is increasing because you can see an abundance of turtles basking. And this is from informal observations and from census that are done once in a while. But after analyzing the interviews and the management reports, we found that the census is not standardized. And there's significant challenges with counting turtles. And this is due to weather, this is due to limitations in travel throughout the reserve, and a lack of a specific standardized method. There was respondents also stated that the population was increasing because the number of nests and eggs collected and translocated every year to artificial beaches increases. So they're saying we find more nests and more eggs every year, therefore the population is growing. And although that may point to an increasing population, it is really difficult to assess this metric because there's no data or methods that consider the role of capture per unit effort. How many people are out looking for eggs and nests, and for how long? And also, this may be a function of the minimum quota set by the government to collect a certain number of nests and eggs each year. So every year, that quota, that number increases. The governing bodies essentially say you need to hit this amount this year in order to be able to legally harvest a certain proportion of eggs and turtles. So that may be driving those numbers. Respondents also stated that the population is increasing because every year more hatchings are released into the water. So they see more and more numbers going into the water, therefore it's increasing. But again, this is a function of the number of hatchings needed to meet the release quota. And I'm not arguing that the population is not increasing, but I'm just showing that these indicators there may be ways to improve these indicators and really track what is going on in the system. From the social and economic perspective, there's a general consensus that group members and their families have benefited economically from trading eggs and hatchlings. And about 20% of the respondents mentioned that there's even social benefits from organizing into groups and jointly managing resources. So here are some of the results from our PVA, or population viability analysis. And I'm only going to show the trends from the third phase, which is what I'm focusing on in this presentation. But I will discuss what happened in the second phase. So at the start of the program in 1994, there were about 62 adult females, and we extrapolated that on a 1-to-1 ratio for all the numbers. So the trend in the population is the known number of females that we started with plus an extrapolation for males, because data don't exist on number of males. So at the start of phase 3 in 2013, and that's year 0 here in this graph, we expected there to be around 16,000 adults. Data from the management reports reveal that the overall population size has definitely increased from the start of the program. However, the results from our PVA suggest that during phase 3 of the management, which began in 2013, and which allows the harvest of 40% of hatchlings per year, the harvest pressure is unsustainable and the population may be in decline. So this trend is shown by the red line in the graph, which tracks the estimated population size over time. And you can compare this to the blue line, which is a baseline trend, and the baseline in blue models a population with natural mortalities, no protection and by humans, and no harvest by humans. Okay, so in that, the population stays at carrying capacity, but within our models under the current harvest rate, there may be unsustainable harvest over time. There may be a declining trend. I do want to say that we base these models on the best available site and species-specific data. However, we need to collect further data on other parameters, such as better estimates of population sizes, including estimates of breeding males, sex ratios of hatchlings at birth, because those sex ratios may vary in the species. There's some data that suggests that there's variation, but based on what we know from turtle biology, and herpetology, especially with changes in temperature, sex ratio may be an important factor to consider. And we have no estimates of illegal poaching rates, but we do know that there's poaching that occurs. And I was there, I witnessed a poaching event, and it's not only an issue for the turtle population, but also for the tensions that arise between community members, park rangers, and those in the management groups. So we did run sensitivity analyses to test those different parameters for which data is uncertain. And the sex ratio parameter, for example, when we varied the male and the female sex ratio, under the second phase, where only 20% of hatchlings are harvested, we get very, very different population trends. So if we skew the sex ratio towards males or towards females at birth, we get different trends over time. However, for the current phase, no matter how much we skew it, at least for sex ratio and for different parameters such as potential poaching rates, all our population trajectories point to a declining population. So this is what we're learning from these models. We also took our social science data from our interviews and analyzed our management reports and created this visual representation of the system in Pacaya Basin. In this model, the blue arrows indicate positive relationships and the red arrows indicate negative relationships. So for example, in the top left, you have job availability in the nearby communities. So we learned that as the job availability decreases, then there's an increase in membership in the organized management groups, okay? So this is the negative, this is the different relationships. So if we look at the bottom part of this system model, we see that there are some interesting feedbacks, where as more nests and eggs are collected and transferred to artificial beaches each year, the more hatchlings are released into the water. And this results in a higher perception of success, as well as increases in the perceived turtle population size. And this perceived increase, as if you follow the arrow here to allowed harvest quota, this perceived increase in the number of turtles in the system is what led to that increase in the allowed harvest quota of 40% of hatchlings per year. We also have another key finding is that a major challenge within this system is that there has been a recent decrease in international demand for turtle hatchlings from China and from Hong Kong. And so in the top right, we have international demand as a component in the system. As you can see the connection to other parts of the system. So international demand is tied to the price of hatchlings and the potential income earned by the community members who are involved. So this is a big cause of concern, or it was when I was there, because most of the income is coming from selling to the intermediary buyers in Iquitos, who then export to Asian markets. And the respondents are really unsure as to why the demand decreased. But it's a major concern as community members invest their time and energy and resources into managing the turtles from July to December. And then in December, they expect a financial return at the end of the year to pay off loans for resources that were invested during the management season and to supply for their families. It was a major, major concern. Other major challenges include mitigating the illegal poaching within the reserve and the need for more logistical support, such as food and fuel for motorboats during the management season. And we think that if we look at this system like this, these challenges may be mitigated by understanding why there's a decrease in international demand and potentially finding alternative opportunities to increase the potential of income earned, potentially increasing the number of park rangers to support the management activities and decrease tensions, because a lot of times the poachers are armed and the community members are not. The ones managing the turtles, they are not, and so there's tensions. And there's scarce park rangers, and it takes a very long time for a park ranger to travel from a station to one of the stations where the community members are. It takes hours to get there. So by that time, it may be too late to mitigate the situation. And of course, a lot of the respondents stated that increased logistical support from the government would be very, very beneficial in terms of food and fuel and other forms of support. So our key takeaways are that community members do rely on trading these turtle eggs and hatchlings to meet their livelihood needs. And despite increases in the managed population since the start of the program, because there have been increases, the current harvest rates may be unsustainable in the long run. Also, there is a recent decline in international demand for turtles from foreign markets. We need to further understand what this international Well, the reduction in international demand may mean not only for the livelihoods of the local people, but also for the long-term viability of the managed turtle population. And in sum, a systems approach is critical in helping to assess the sustainability of wildlife harvest and trade systems for conservation, as assessments based only on biological or social data alone may lead to varied interpretations of the system. So that was the case study that I wanted to present. And I want to thank my mentors, committee members for my master's program, and all of the support I received in terms of funding and time and mentorship, as well as logistic support on the ground. So that was in Pacaya Sumida National Reserve. And now I'm gonna shift gears and present the results of a preliminary site visit to the same Loreto region last summer in 2019, but not in Pacaya Sumida National Reserve, now to the greater Iquitos region. And so Iquitos is the capital of Loreto, this department of Peru. This research last summer in 2019 was made possible by a TCD field research grant, for which I'm very, very grateful. So I traveled to Iquitos in the greater Iquitos region, and I conducted formal interviews with key informants who work in a variety of conservation organizations. And I wanted to understand different priorities for research on harvest, trade, and conservation of wildlife in the region. And I wanted to go with an open mind, but making sure that I was understanding the ecological and biological dimensions are important. Also keeping an eye out for different aspects of governance. Who are the actors involved, from market sellers to local people to government officials, etc. So I wanted to come back with an idea of potential variables to measure, to ask different questions, and to understand the wildlife harvest and trade system. So the goal was to figure out essentially my questions that I would address for my dissertation, or some of the questions I will address. So today I'm going to present two general projects that I hope to pursue. I also conducted a lot of informal interviews with market sellers, local residents, had conversations with friends, new friends, and just did a lot of observation, which is really incredible. So after my trip, I decided to focus my dissertation research on wildlife trade in the Iquitos urban system. At first, I thought I was going to work with communities around the city, but I think I'm going to focus it on this urban system. So as we know that around the global tropics and in the Amazon specifically, there's a growing population shift of humans from rural to urban centers. And that is definitely the case in Iquitos. Urban centers throughout the tropics are important for the consumption of wildlife, for wildlife tourism, and also for the conservation of wildlife. Iquitos, Peru, as you can see here, is a metropolis in the northeastern Peruvian Amazon. So here is the city. You have the Amazon River, and then you have different rivers crossing on different sides. It's essentially an island, and it's called the capital of the Peruvian Amazon. It is the largest city in the world that can only be reached by river or air. It has about 437,000 inhabitants, a little over that. And is a critically important location for residents, tourists, and researchers conducting business and leisure in the Amazon. The Loreto region has high rates of biological and cultural diversity. There's about 27 languages from 15 language families spoken in the region alone. So given my interest in primatology and also human and non-human primate relationships and interactions, I wanted to focus a part of my dissertation research on the consumption of primates in this urban system. Okay, so the Loreto region has the highest primate species richness in Peru. There's areas with about 14 different species of sympatric primates. And the region as a whole is part of the Amazonian high biodiversity wilderness area. The city and the region is a key location for both primate consumption and trade and conservation. And if you look at the map here on the left that was produced by Shani et al., we can see the different river routes and terrestrial routes for primate trade specifically in Peru. And with these flags right here, you can see the different wildlife markets in the country. So as you can see, Iquitos is a major center It's a hub for the trade of wildlife, but specifically of primates, and it's also part of this river route. So it's a critical and critically important area. And so, let's 1 second, please. Okay. So I thought, okay, let me look a little bit more into primate harvest and trade and different human and human primate relationships. And so understanding the ways that diverse actors value wildlife can have implications towards mitigating issues of wildlife consumption and exploitation, particularly exploitation across different ecological, social, cultural, and political contexts. So the main objective of this specific project, I'm going to call it Chapter A for the purpose of this presentation, is to integrate ecological and social science data to understand the values attributed to primates by diverse stakeholders in Iquitos and the impacts of these values on the consumption and conservation of primates. So to clarify that a bit, I will use this transvaluation framework. And transvaluation refers to the way that different actors, different people value species on the basis of their ecological, economic, and symbolic roles in human lives. So it's really trying to untangle simultaneous and multiple values that may exist within one system from different people, different stakeholders. Again, it's interdisciplinary. It denotes that diverse actors and communities can impact the consumption and conservation of species based on differing value orientations that extend beyond market values, okay? So we're not just looking at, is it profitable for me economically to sell certain monkey species in the market? There may be other reasons that these species have value to me, okay? And that could be ecological value, it could be based on the nutrition that may come from consuming the species. It may be from the deep relationships such as pet keeping or consumption of wild meat that we may have, right? Not just money, not just market values. And also the symbolic roles that primates may play in the lives of Iquitos residents, but also the people visiting from nearby and immigrating from other communities. So the idea is that understanding these differences in attitudes and values of different groups of people within a shared system can result in better understanding complex system dynamics. And also understanding diverse and intersecting or divergent values people have towards wildlife can inform equitable conservation that dismantles social hierarchies, okay? So it's not just if the value of, say, a conservation organization is to conserve a species, but a certain value, I value primates because of the cultural attachment I have to them, or the nutrition they may provide for me, or the economic importance. These values may be very different between the same system. So in order to have more equitable solutions to conservation, we really need to understand what is the role of these species and diverse roles of these species in the lives of different people. And so that is the idea, so that we don't run into a one blanket approach. So we don't just say increase law enforcement, as we see in the literature often with wildlife trade issues, because that's what we see over and over. So we want to really dismantle those social hierarchies. So that was the general idea for one of the projects. I'm happy to go into details and answer questions regarding methodologies later on, but now I just want to move on to my second idea in the interest of time. So I've been discussing wildlife trade, okay, and harvest and trade, but what has been fascinating to me as I traveled throughout Southeast Asia, East Asia, and now South America has been coming across these wildlife markets, the physical gathering places for the trade of live animals and their derivatives. These markets are incredible, fascinating places. They're situated within complex social systems defined by dynamic cultural, socioeconomic, and socio-political dimensions. A lot of studies on these market spaces have focused on Asian and African contexts, and a lot of studies have focused on the bushmeat trade. So in my opinion, the markets are very understudied in the New World tropics when comparing to these other regions. There's no clear path forward on the management side for how to address issues of overexploitation, or illegal trade or unsustainable trade that's fueled by these market spaces. There have been calls for increased focus on resources on regulatory efforts, like I mentioned, such as increased law enforcement in markets, but there's lack of resources often deterring increase in law enforcement. It's lack of resources, tensions between local cultural practices and decentralized government policies, and issues like this can really impede progress towards sustainable trade and an overall understanding of market dynamics. So I argue that we really need new approaches to understanding these places, that we need to really characterize these dynamic spaces as socio-ecological systems and strive towards more feasible and holistic conservation and management interventions. So what I hope to do is I hope to use the famous Belén market in Iquitos as a case study. And what I want to do is I want to apply a historical perspective towards understanding the social and ecological factors and interactions that have contributed to the persistence of this market over time and to the trade of wildlife and wildlife products. Because you talk to many stakeholders on the ground, you can talk to the police, you can talk to the consumers, the traders, and local residents, and they know that a lot of the species are protected. The organizations are only a couple miles away. The ecological police is only a couple miles away, sometimes really close by. But the activity persists, right? And we see this across the world in the tropics. These markets persist. So I want to learn what are the different components, social and ecological, what are the different interactions that lead to the persistence of these markets and trade of wildlife over time. Because clearly, continuing to say increased law enforcement is not necessarily fixing the issue, right? So Belén Market is an incredible place. It is the largest wildlife market in Iquitos in the Peruvian Amazon. It dates back to the beginning of the 20th century, covers more than 20 blocks, has two zones, upper and lower zones. Members of over 150 communities in the Loreto region travel to Belén Market to trade culturally, biologically, and nutritionally important resources, okay? Past studies in the market have looked at spiritual tourism and trade, primate trade, and the wild meat trade. There's commercial activities, include both legal and illegal trade for wild meat and some live resources, but there is a lack of resources, capacity, infrastructure, and protocols that really make it difficult to understand the dynamics of the trade and understand whether we can have sustainable trade. So my goal is to work on a framework. So this is only the beginning of the framework where I adapt the socio-ecological systems framework specifically to the wildlife market spaces. So what I want to do is apply that framework to the Belén market. I want to conduct oral histories with key informants and also conduct archival research in the Amazonian Library of Iquitos to see how this market has changed over time. And the different variables you see in this framework, some of them, for example, I already have a sense of which ones I can keep an eye out for as I look through historical records, as I conduct oral history interviews. Then we can parse the data into different time periods and really try to understand long-term impacts. So for example, if there was a policy 20 years ago that said there will be no wildlife trade of live primates, for example, allowed in Belén market, but then we can see what happened 10, 20 years later. How has that changed? Has that been enforced? Have the traded species changed? How conspicuous are the people in selling? Have prices changed? Has income changed? So we can get this from talking to people, but also triangulating that data from different historical records of market dynamics, of the history of Iquitos, the history of the market, changes in migration into the city, and also species lists and changes in population sizes if available. So this is the start of developing a framework that hopefully I'll be writing developing soon before I formally conduct more research.
Hey, Christian.
Mm-hmm.
I was sending you messages, but we're at time if you want to go ahead and start to wrap up.
Excellent. No, so that's essentially it.
Perfect.
So thank you.